A wounded stranger offers 10 prime beaver furs for just one night by her fire, but the widow gave him a second chance. Sarah Whitlock always measured danger by sound. A coyote's howl drifting across the valley after sunset meant the chickens needed another look before bed. The creak of cottonwood branches in a hard wind meant a storm was rolling down from the mountains. The hurried pounding of horse hooves after dark meant someone was either desperate or being chased. But silence? Silence was what unsettled her most. On that late autumn evening, silence settled over the Wyoming territory like a heavy wool blanket. Snow had begun falling shortly after noon, soft at first, then thicker as gray clouds swallowed the last traces of blue sky. By dusk, the familiar wagon trail leading through Cotton Creek Valley had vanished beneath a smooth sheet of white. Fence posts wore caps of snow. Pine trees bowed beneath its growing weight. Even the creek itself seemed quieter, its running water muffled beneath fresh ice forming along its banks. Sarah stood on the small porch of her cabin, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders. She scanned the valley one final time before going inside. Nothing moved. No wagons. No riders. No lanterns glowing in distant windows. Only snow. That was how she preferred it. 3 winters had passed since she buried her husband, Thomas Whitlock, beneath the old oak tree overlooking the pasture. 3 winters of chopping her own firewood, repairing fences with blistered hands, planting crops in spring, harvesting before frost, and stretching every sack of flour until the next supply wagon came through. 3 winters of pretending she wasn't afraid. She turned toward the door. "Caleb," she called inside, "did you bring in the kindling?" "I stacked it by the stove, Ma." "And the chickens?" "They're shut in. The latch. I checked it twice." Sarah smiled despite herself. Good. Her son had learned young that on the frontier, forgetting one small thing could cost you dearly. Caleb was only 8 years old, but hardship had aged him beyond his years. The cheerful chatter that once filled the cabin before his father's death had given way to long stretches of thoughtful silence. He still smiled now and then, usually when chasing rabbits or carving little animals from scraps of pine, but the carefree laughter of childhood had become a rare visitor. Sarah missed that laughter almost as much as she missed Thomas. Inside, warmth greeted her as she closed the heavy oak door behind her. The cabin was simple but well kept. A cast-iron stove glowed with steady heat. Cornbread cooled on the table beside a pot of venison stew. A rocking chair rested near the fireplace, where Thomas had once spent evenings reading aloud from the family Bible while Caleb drifted to sleep against his shoulder. The chair remained empty now. Sarah often caught herself looking toward it anyway. Old habits, she supposed, never truly left. She stirred the stew while Caleb sat on the floor whittling a tiny horse from a piece of cedar. His tongue poked from the corner of his mouth in deep concentration. "It'll have 4 legs this time," he announced proudly. Sarah laughed softly. "I certainly hope so." The last one looked more like a goat. It surely did. For a few precious moments the cabin felt almost normal. Then the wind changed. A long gust rattled the shutters hard enough to make both of them look toward the window. Snow lashed against the glass. Sarah frowned. No one should be traveling tonight. Caleb glanced up. What if somebody gets lost? They should have found shelter before the storm. What if they couldn't? Sarah hesitated. Life on the frontier had taught her lessons she wished her son never needed to learn. "Sometimes," she said carefully, "good folks make bad decisions. And bad folks. They count on good folks opening their doors." Caleb nodded, though she could see he didn't fully understand. She prayed he never would. After supper they settled into their evening routine. Caleb read haltingly from a worn school primer while Sarah mended one of his shirts beneath the glow of an oil lamp. Outside, darkness swallowed the valley completely. The storm grew louder. Snow hissed across the roof. The chimney groaned under the wind. Somewhere in the distance, wolves called to one another. Sarah quietly rose and checked the rifle resting above the fireplace. She didn't expect trouble, but she had long ago stopped confusing hope with preparation. She made certain the front door was barred. Then she checked it again. Only after she was satisfied did she lower the lamp's flame. Caleb yawned. "I'm tired." "I know." She tucked another blanket around his shoulders before sending him toward the loft above the main room. "Say your prayers." "I already did." "What did you pray for?" He shrugged. "Same thing." "What was that?" "That Pa knows we still miss him." Sarah swallowed hard. "So do I." The boy disappeared upstairs, leaving her alone with the crackling fire. She sat in Thomas's empty rocking chair. Some nights, the loneliness came like a gentle rain. Other nights, it struck like a hammer. Tonight was the latter. She stared into the flames, remembering another snowy evening years before. Thomas had burst through that same door with a sack of flour over one shoulder and a grin on his face, snow clinging to his beard. "I thought the storm would beat me home," he'd laughed. She could almost hear it. Almost. A sharp sound pulled her back to the present. Not the wind. Not the wolves. A horse. Faint. Slow. Uneven. Sarah froze. The hoofbeats came again. Closer this time. One hoof dragging slightly between steps as though the animal was exhausted. No traveler rode like that unless something was terribly wrong. She extinguished the lamp, leaving only the firelight. Then she reached for the rifle. The horse stopped outside. Silence returned. Even the wind seemed to pause. Sarah stood motionless, every sense sharpened. Then came 3 knocks. Slow. Measured. Not the frantic pounding of a man fleeing danger. Not the arrogant pounding of a man expecting obedience. Just 3 quiet knocks. She waited. Nothing followed. No voice. No plea. Only the muffled whistle of snow against the cabin walls. Carefully, she stepped to the window and lifted the edge of the curtain. A single rider stood on the porch. He was taller than most men she knew, wrapped in a weather-beaten buckskin coat darkened by melting snow. A wide-brimmed hat hid much of his face, but even in the dim light she could see he was swaying where he stood. His horse hung its head low, ribs faintly visible beneath its winter coat. Steam rose from its nostrils as it struggled for breath. Sarah noticed something else. Blood. Dark stains spread across the stranger's left side, nearly blending with the soaked buckskin. He hadn't come here unhurt. The man slowly untied a leather bundle from his saddle. With visible effort, he carried it to the porch and set it gently on the floorboards. He stepped back, never reaching for a weapon, never touching the door. Sarah cracked it open only a few inches, keeping the rifle hidden behind it. "What do you want?" The stranger's voice was rough, little more than a whisper carried by the wind. "One night." She said nothing. He nudged the bundle forward with his boot. The leather flap fell open. Even in the firelight spilling through the doorway, Sarah recognized them instantly. Beaver pelts. Not ordinary ones. 10 prime winter pelts. Each thick, glossy, and perfectly cured. The finest she'd ever seen. Her breath caught. The bundle represented nearly a year's worth of earnings. Enough to buy livestock, seed, tools, and provisions with money left over. "I'll give you all of them," the stranger said quietly. "For one night beside your fire." Sarah looked from the priceless furs to the man before her. His face was pale beneath the snow clinging to his beard. His breathing had grown shallow. One gloved hand pressed against the wound in his side, though it was clear he no longer had the strength to stop the bleeding. His eyes met hers at last. There was no anger in them. No threat. Only exhaustion. And a loneliness that looked strangely familiar. Then, before she could answer, his knees buckled. He collapsed onto the snow-covered porch, the storm swallowing the sound of his fall. Behind her, Caleb's frightened voice echoed down from the loft. "Ma, who's outside?" Sarah tightened her grip on the rifle. She had spent 3 years surviving by never trusting strangers. Now one lay bleeding at her doorstep, with a fortune in beaver furs at his feet. The next choice she made would change all of their lives. The stranger did not move. For one terrible moment, Sarah thought he had died before she had even made her decision. She set the rifle against the wall and knelt beside him, brushing the snow from his face. His skin was cold, but when she pressed 2 fingers against the side of his neck, she found it. A pulse. Weak. Slow. But there. "Caleb," she called. Small footsteps thundered down the ladder. The boy stopped halfway across the room when he saw the man sprawled across the porch. "Is he dead?" "No." "Is he dangerous?" "I don't know." Sarah hated giving that answer. On the frontier, uncertainty was often more frightening than knowing the truth. She looked at the horse standing patiently in the storm. It never pulled at the reins or stamped nervously. Instead, it lowered its head toward its fallen rider as if waiting for him to rise. "A mean horse usually belongs to a mean man," Thomas had once told her. This horse looked loyal. Almost worried. "Help me," Sarah said. Together they dragged the stranger across the threshold. He was heavier than he looked, his boots scraping grooves across the pine floor. Snow melted from his clothes, leaving dark puddles behind. Sarah barred the door again. If she had made a mistake, there would be no turning back now. The fire snapped and hissed as she fed it more wood. "Bring the kettle," she told Caleb. The boy hurried to obey. Sarah carefully cut away the blood-soaked buckskin around the stranger's left side. She stopped. The wound wasn't fresh. It had begun healing days earlier before reopening. A bullet had entered just beneath his ribs and torn through the flesh without striking bone. It should have killed him from infection alone. Instead, someone had cleaned it before wrapping it with surprisingly careful hands. Whoever had done it had likely saved his life. Yet he had traveled on anyway. Foolish man, she thought. Or determined. She warmed water, mixed crushed yarrow with bear grease, and cleaned the wound as gently as she could. Even unconscious, the stranger winced. His face tightened with pain. "Easy," Sarah whispered without thinking. She had used those same words countless times while tending Thomas after long days of ranch work. The memory stung. When the fresh bandage was tied in place, she finally noticed the rest of him. He carried scars. Not one or two. Dozens. Thin white lines crossed his forearms. A jagged mark disappeared beneath his collar. An old burned scar covered part of one shoulder. This was a man who had survived things most people never saw. Caleb, sitting nearby with wide eyes, pointed toward a leather cord hanging around the stranger's neck. "Ma." Sarah hesitated before lifting it. A plain gold wedding ring rested on the cord. Not on his finger. Around his neck. She stared at it for a long moment before letting it fall back beneath his shirt. "You see that?" Caleb whispered. "I did." "Why doesn't he wear it?" "I don't know." But she suspected she did. Some people removed wedding rings because they wished to forget. Others wore them close to their hearts because forgetting was impossible. She knew which kind she was. Later, as she hung the stranger's damp coat near the stove, something slipped from one of its inner pockets. A small Bible. Its leather cover had been worn smooth from years of use. The edges of its pages were stained with water and smoke. Inside the front cover was written in careful handwriting. Elias Mercer. Beneath the name was another. Anna Mercer. And below that, Matthew. The final word had been written in much smaller letters. Almost as though someone had struggled to finish it. Sarah closed the Bible quietly. She did not ask questions the dead could no longer answer. As she folded the stranger's belongings, one last object rolled free from his pack. A tiny wooden horse. Simple. Hand-carved. Its legs were uneven. Its ears too large. One side had been sanded smoother than the other. Caleb picked it up. "He made this. Looks that way. It isn't very good." Sarah smiled faintly. "It wasn't meant for selling." The boy turned it over. "Then why make it?" She looked again at the wedding ring. The Bible. The careful carving. For someone he loved. Caleb nodded thoughtfully before placing it beside the stranger's bedroll. No one spoke for a while. Outside, the storm raged through the night. Inside, only the crackling fire broke the silence. Near dawn, the fever came. Elias began trembling violently. His breathing quickened. Sweat soaked his hair despite the cold. Then the words started. Broken. Scattered. Fragments escaping from somewhere deep inside him. "No. I'm coming. Stay behind me. Anna." His voice cracked. "Matthew." Sarah looked away. She had heard men speak in fever before. Some cursed. Some begged. Some fought invisible enemies. This man only called for people who were no longer there. She dipped a cloth into cool water and laid it across his forehead. For hours she sat beside him while Caleb slept upstairs. The fire burned low. The storm finally drifted east. Morning sunlight slipped through the frost-covered windows. Elias opened his eyes. Only for a moment. He looked directly at Sarah. Confusion filled his face. "You should have left me." His voice was barely audible. She answered while adjusting another log onto the fire. "You nearly made that choice for me." His lips almost formed a smile. "I couldn't pay enough." Sarah glanced toward the bundle of beaver pelts still resting untouched near the door. "I haven't decided about that." He closed his eyes again. "You earned them." "No. You took me in. I kept you alive." "Same thing." She looked at him carefully. Most men she'd known would have begun bargaining. Or boasting. Or demanding. This one simply sounded grateful. That alone made him different. By afternoon, the fever had broken. Elias managed to sit up with Sarah's help, though every movement clearly hurt. Caleb watched him from across the room, curiosity battling caution. Finally, the boy gathered enough courage to speak. "Did you really trap all those beavers?" Elias looked toward the stack of pelts. "Most of them." "How many have you caught?" He thought for a moment. "I stopped counting after 1,000. Caleb's eyes grew enormous. 1,000? Maybe more. "Were there grizzly bears?" "A few. Wolves? More than I liked." "Did you ever see Indians?" Elias chuckled softly. I've shared meals with some. You fought them? The stranger's smile disappeared. No. Never? Not unless I had no other choice. Caleb frowned. My pa always said fighting should be the last thing a man reaches for. Elias looked into the fire. Your father was wiser than many. Sarah noticed the way he answered. No pride. No stories of glory. Just quiet honesty. Later that afternoon, while Caleb carried water from the well, Sarah prepared broth. Elias spoke without looking up. You have questions. I do. You've earned answers. She handed him the steaming bowl. Start with your name. Elias Mercer. Where are you headed? He stared into the broth. I haven't known that for years. She waited. People often filled silence with truth. I trapped the mountains, he said at last. For nearly 20 years. You worked alone? Not at first. The room grew still. I had a wife. Sarah said nothing. And a son. His thumb unconsciously rubbed the wedding ring hanging beneath his shirt. There was sickness one winter. Started in a settlement north of the river. His voice became distant, as though he were watching the memories instead of speaking them. It spread faster than the snow. Sarah lowered her eyes. She already knew how the story ended. I was gone trapping. His jaw tightened. When I came home. He stopped. The silence lasted so long that Sarah thought he would go no further. When I came home, I buried both of them beneath a pine overlooking the valley. Neither of them spoke. Outside, sunlight sparkled on the fresh snow. Inside, grief sat quietly between two people who understood its language without needing many words. Finally Sarah whispered, My husband died 3 winters ago. Elias looked up. Their eyes met. No explanations were needed. No comforting speeches. No promises that time healed everything. Some wounds simply became part of the people who carried them. Caleb burst back through the door carrying a bucket of water, unaware of the silence he interrupted. I saw deer tracks. Sarah smiled at him. Did you? Big ones. He looked at Elias. When you get better, will you show me how to track them? The trapper looked surprised. He glanced toward Sarah, almost asking permission. She gave the smallest nod. If your mother allows it, Elias said. Caleb grinned for the first time in what felt like months. I'll ask her every day until she says yes. Sarah laughed softly. It was only a brief moment. Only a child's excitement over learning something new. But it filled the little cabin with something she had not realized had been missing. Hope. For the first time since the stranger had crossed her threshold, Sarah wondered if God had sent more than a wounded trapper to her door. Perhaps he had sent 2 lonely souls exactly where they were needed most. The storm passed as quickly as it had come. By the 3rd morning, the valley lay beneath a brilliant blue sky. Snow still covered the fields, but the sun had begun its slow work, turning the rooftops into dripping eaves and softening the wagon ruts that disappeared toward the distant hills. Sarah opened the cabin door just after dawn. The air carried that crisp scent that only came after a hard snowfall, pine, wet earth, and wood smoke drifting from scattered homesteads across the valley. It was beautiful. And deceptive. Winter had a way of making everything look peaceful, even when danger was drawing near. Behind her she heard slow footsteps. Elias emerged from the small room where he had been resting, one hand braced against the doorframe. His face still looked pale, but the fever had left him. You should still be in bed, Sarah said. I've spent enough days lying down. You've also spent enough days bleeding. A faint smile crossed his weathered face. I've been told I'm a stubborn man. I believe it. He stepped carefully onto the porch and breathed deeply. I'd forgotten what a home smells like. Sarah looked at him. What does it smell like? He closed his eyes. Bread baking. He paused. Wood smoke. Another pause. And someone waiting for you to come back. He opened his eyes again. I haven't smelled that in years. Sarah had no answer. Instead, she handed him a steaming tin cup. Drink. He accepted it without argument. Caleb was already outside. The boy had found a line of rabbit tracks crossing the yard and was following them with complete concentration. Elias watched him for a long moment. He's improving. Sarah looked surprised. You noticed? He doesn't look at the ground anymore. What do you mean? When children lose someone they love, they spend a long time watching their own feet. Sarah frowned. And now? Now he's looking ahead. She had never thought about it before. Yet she realized Elias was right. 4 months after Thomas died, Caleb had walked with his head lowered, speaking little and noticing even less of the world around him. Lately. His eyes had begun searching the horizon again. By mid-morning, Elias insisted on helping. Sarah refused. "You'll tear that wound open. I've split enough firewood with worse injuries." "That doesn't make it wise. It makes it necessary." She sighed. "There are lighter chores." So Elias began repairing broken harness straps instead. His hands moved with practiced precision. Every stitch was neat. Every knot secure. Watching him work, Sarah realized something. This wasn't merely a trapper. He was a craftsman. He repaired a cracked bucket handle. Sharpened a dull axe. Adjusted the hinges on the chicken coop door without being asked. He never sought praise. Whenever Sarah thanked him, he simply nodded and moved on to the next task. Thomas had been much the same. The thought startled her. She quickly pushed it aside. No one could replace her husband. No one ever would. That afternoon, the sound of wagon wheels echoed up the lane. Sarah looked toward the road. Mrs. Abigail Turner climbed down from her wagon carrying a basket covered with cloth. Abigail lived nearly a mile away with her husband and 3 daughters. She often stopped by with butter or fresh eggs. Today, however, her eyes weren't on Sarah. They settled immediately on Elias. He stood near the woodshed, quietly splitting kindling. Abigail lowered her voice. "Who's that?" "A traveler." "He's staying long?" "Just until he's strong enough to leave." Abigail's expression tightened. "I've never seen him." "No. Where'd he come from?" "He didn't say." Abigail looked uneasy. "There've been stories." Sarah folded her arms. "What stories?" "Stagecoach robbery south of Casper." "That was weeks away." "Men move. So do rumors." Abigail hesitated. "I'm only saying, be careful." "I always am." Abigail wasn't convinced. Before leaving, she looked once more toward Elias. He tipped his hat politely. She returned the gesture, though uncertainty lingered on her face. As her wagon disappeared down the trail, Sarah knew exactly what would happen next. By supper, everyone within 10 miles would know there was a stranger staying at the Whitlock cabin. She was right. The following morning, 2 riders slowed as they passed the property. Neither stopped. Both stared. Later, another wagon rolled by much more slowly than necessary. Children pointed. Men whispered. Frontier settlements survived on cooperation. They also survived on information. Every unfamiliar face became a subject of conversation. By evening, Elias noticed it too. "They're talking." Sarah continued kneading bread. "They are. I should leave." "No." He looked surprised. "They're already suspicious. They were suspicious before you arrived. I don't want trouble finding your doorstep." She stopped kneading. "It already found mine 3 years ago." He understood what she meant. Widows learned quickly that some people viewed them as helpless. Others viewed them as opportunities. She had dealt with both. "I can handle gossip," she said. He wasn't so sure. The next afternoon brought a different visitor. This time it wasn't a neighbor. It was the town marshal. Marshal Ben Carter rode a broad-chested bay gelding and wore the calm expression of a man who had spent 20 years settling arguments before they became gunfights. Sarah greeted him on the porch. "Marshal." "Mrs. Whitlock." He removed his hat respectfully. "Heard you've taken in a traveler." "I have." "You mind if I speak with him?" Sarah glanced toward the barn. Elias stepped out before she could answer. "No need," he said calmly. "I'm here." The marshal studied him for several long seconds. His brow furrowed. "I'll be." Recognition slowly spread across his face. "Elias Mercer?" Elias looked equally surprised. "I know you." "Probably not." The marshal laughed softly. "We crossed paths 12 years ago outside Fort Bridger." Elias searched his memory. There was a wagon train. There was. Sarah watched the exchange carefully. Marshal Carter smiled. "My youngest sister would have died that day if not for you." Elias blinked. "I don't remember." "You pulled 3 children out of a burning wagon after a lantern exploded." "It wasn't just me." "Maybe not." The marshal shook his head. "But I remember the mountain man who walked through flames twice because he heard another child crying." Sarah turned toward Elias. He had never mentioned such a thing. In fact, he looked almost uncomfortable hearing it. "It was a long time ago," Elias said quietly. The marshal nodded. "Good deeds usually are." After a few more questions, Carter looked toward Sarah. "I've heard people wondering if you're harboring an outlaw." "And?" "I don't believe you are." Relief washed over Sarah's face. "But," the marshal continued, "that doesn't mean everyone else will see it that way." He lowered his voice. There are folks who remember different stories. What kind? The marshal looked directly at Elias. Stories involving a man named Jeremiah Crow. The warmth seemed to leave the afternoon. Elias's jaw tightened. I hoped he'd forgotten me. Marshal Carter gave a humorless smile. Men like Crow don't forget. Sarah spoke carefully. Who is he? The marshal's face darkened. A fur trader. Elias answered before he could continue. The richest in 3 territories. And the meanest, the marshal added. Years ago, Carter explained, Crow had built his fortune by buying furs from independent trappers at unfair prices. When some refused, accidents happened. Cabins burned. Trap lines disappeared. Horses vanished. A few men simply never came home. No one could ever prove Crow had ordered it. But nearly everyone believed it. Elias wouldn't sell, Carter said. He owned some of the finest trapping country in the mountains. Elias stared toward the distant ridgeline. It wasn't mine to sell. Crow had offered more money than Elias had ever seen. When Elias refused, the offers became threats. Eventually, Elias abandoned those trapping grounds altogether after losing his family. He had never returned. I figured that was the end of it, Elias admitted. The marshal sighed. Crow recently expanded into this valley. Sarah felt a knot tighten in her stomach. You think he'll come here? I think if he learns Elias Mercer is alive. The marshal didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. That evening, silence settled over the cabin once again. Caleb slept upstairs after an exhausting day helping Elias mend fence rails. Sarah and Elias sat near the fire. Neither spoke for a long while. Finally Sarah broke the silence. Why didn't you tell me? I didn't think it mattered. A man might come looking for you. I've spent years making sure no one could. She looked into the flames. You still could have warned me. He nodded. I should have. There was genuine regret in his voice. I've tried to live quietly. So have I. He looked around the little cabin. I've already stayed longer than I intended. You've stayed exactly as long as your wound required. He smiled faintly. You always answer questions without really answering them. My husband used to say the same thing. The smile faded, replaced by a comfortable silence. Outside, the wind stirred the pine trees. Far beyond the valley, unseen in the gathering darkness, another rider studied fresh tracks leading toward the Whitlock homestead. The man leaned down from his saddle and lifted a scrap of buckskin caught on a thorn bush. He smiled. So, he muttered to himself, the old mountain ghost is still breathing. He tucked the scrap into his coat and turned his horse toward the south. By sunrise, Jeremiah Crow would know exactly where to find Elias Mercer. And with that knowledge, the peace Sarah Whitlock had fought so hard to build was about to be tested in ways she could never have imagined. The valley awakened beneath a pale winter sun. Thin ribbons of smoke curled from cabin chimneys. Frost clung to every fence rail, turning ordinary cedar posts into silver pillars that sparkled in the morning light. Somewhere beyond the pasture, a rooster crowed, answered by another farther down the valley. It was the kind of morning that made life seem ordinary. Sarah had learned never to trust mornings like that. She stood at the kitchen table kneading bread while Caleb fed scraps of corn to the chickens outside. Through the window she could see Elias carrying 2 buckets of water from the well. He still favored his injured side. His steps remained careful. But each day he looked a little stronger. A week ago he had arrived at her doorstep unable to stand. Now he insisted on earning every meal placed before him. She watched as he paused near the woodshed to catch his breath before continuing toward the house. Stubborn, she whispered with a shake of her head. Yet she could not deny something had changed inside the little cabin. It no longer echoed with silence. It echoed with conversation. Sometimes even laughter. The kind she had nearly forgotten. That afternoon, Caleb burst through the front door carrying a handful of carved sticks. Elias. The trapper looked up from repairing a saddle blanket. What the you got there? I made traps. Elias raised an eyebrow. You made something. Caleb grinned. They don't work. Not yet. The boy's smile faded. I knew it. Elias motioned him closer. Come here. For the next hour, the two of them sat cross-legged on the floor while Elias patiently explained how a trap should balance, how animals noticed anything unnatural, and why patience mattered more than strength. You can never hurry the wilderness, he said. It'll always outwait you. Caleb listened as though every word were treasure. Sarah quietly watched from the stove. Thomas had once spent evenings teaching Caleb much the same way. Never raising his voice. Never mocking mistakes. Only guiding. She felt tears threaten the corners of her eyes. Not because Elias reminded her of Thomas. He didn't. They were different men. But because she had forgotten how comforting it was simply to hear someone teaching her son again. The house felt alive. A few days later, Elias stood alone near the barn, staring toward the mountains. Sarah joined him. "You've been looking that direction all morning. My cabin used to be somewhere beyond those peaks. You've thought about going back?" "I have. Will you?" He was quiet for a long while. "When Anna was alive, we planted an apple tree." Sarah looked at him. "It couldn't have survived." "I know. But part of me still wonders." He gave a weary smile. "Funny thing about grief." "What?" "It keeps convincing you that yesterday is waiting where you left it." Sarah understood that feeling all too well. More than once she had awakened expecting to hear Thomas splitting wood before sunrise. Some mornings she still caught herself setting out 3 plates instead of 2. Grief had strange habits. It did not ask permission before visiting. That evening, after supper, Elias carried the bundle of beaver pelts from beside the door and placed it carefully on the kitchen table. Sarah looked up. "What are you doing?" "They belong to you." She returned to washing dishes. "I told you before." "I insisted." "So am I." "Their payment." She dried her hands and faced him. "No. You saved my life. I opened my door. You dressed my wound. I would have done that for anyone. You fed me. I had enough to share." He slid the bundle toward her. "Please." Sarah looked down at the rich brown pelts. Each one was flawless. Prime winter fur. She knew exactly what they were worth. Enough to buy another horse. Enough to replace her leaking roof. Enough to secure Caleb's future for years. Any sensible person would have accepted them. Instead, she pushed them back across the table. "I don't want them." Elias frowned. "I don't understand." She smiled gently. "I know." He looked genuinely confused. "You've earned them." She folded her hands. "No. You don't realize what these are worth." "I realize exactly what they're worth." "Then why refuse?" Sarah glanced toward the loft where Caleb slept peacefully above them. Her voice softened. "Because you've already paid me." He stared at her. "How?" She was silent for a moment before answering. "My boy laughed yesterday." Elias blinked. "What?" He laughed. She looked toward the ceiling again. "The first real laugh I've heard since we buried his father." The words hung quietly in the room. Sarah continued. "For 3 years this cabin has been full of work." She smiled sadly. "Work in silence." She looked at Elias. "Then you came." "I didn't do anything." "You taught him how to carve a whistle." Elias shrugged. "Any trapper knows that." "You showed him rabbit tracks." "He wanted to learn." "You listened to his questions." "They deserved answers." She shook her head. "You still don't see it." He lowered his eyes. "I suppose I don't." "You gave my son something I'd begun to fear was gone forever." His brow furrowed. "What's that?" "Wonder." The word settled between them like a prayer. "He talks about rivers he's never seen." Sarah smiled. "He wants to learn the names of birds. He asks whether mountains look different at sunrise." Her eyes glistened. "For the first time since Thomas died." She paused. "For the first time." "He's looking toward tomorrow instead of yesterday." Elias could not speak. Sarah stepped closer. "So tell me." She rested one hand gently atop the bundle of pelts. "How much is that worth?" He looked at the furs. Then toward the loft. Then back at Sarah. Finally he whispered, "More than these." She nodded. "Exactly." The next morning, Caleb was practicing with a homemade sling outside when he noticed something unusual near the edge of the property. 3 riders. Far away. Watching. He squinted. "They're just passing," he muttered. But they didn't pass. They remained on the ridge for several minutes before disappearing back into the pines. When he mentioned it to Elias later, the trapper's face grew serious. "How many?" 3. "They armed?" "I think so." "What did their horses look like?" "Dark." Elias said nothing more. But Sarah noticed him checking the rifle before hanging it above the fireplace that evening. 2 days later, Marshal Ben Carter arrived again. This time he rode hard. His horse was sweating despite the cold. Sarah met him before he reached the porch. "What's wrong?" The marshal removed his hat. "I was hoping I was mistaken." "Mistaken about what?" He looked past her toward Elias, who had stepped outside. "Crow knows." Elias's shoulders stiffened. "How?" "One of his buyers recognized your horse in town. I should have sold it years ago." It wouldn't have mattered. The marshal lowered his voice. Crow's been asking questions. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. What kind of questions? How many people live here? How often neighbors visit? Whether Mrs. Whitlock keeps firearms. He paused. And whether the trapper is healed enough to travel. Silence settled over the yard. Finally Sarah asked, "How long?" The marshal looked toward the southern trail. "If Crow's riding himself." He took a slow breath. "Not long." That night, sleep refused to come. Sarah sat alone by the fire after Caleb and Elias had both gone to bed. The flames danced softly across the stone hearth. She remembered another fire years ago. Thomas had once told her, "Hospitality costs something." She had laughed. "What?" "Sometimes food. Sometimes sleep. Sometimes safety." She had asked if it was worth it. He'd smiled. If the Lord only welcomed people when it was convenient, where would any of us be? At the time she had thought he was simply talking about neighbors. Now she understood. Kindness always carried risk. Always. She looked toward the staircase where Caleb slept peacefully. Then toward the room where Elias rested. A stranger had crossed her threshold carrying wounds no one else could see. She had offered him warmth, food, a place by the fire. In return he had quietly brought life back into a grieving home. No stack of beaver pelts could ever measure that. Sarah rose from her chair, walked to the kitchen table, and placed the bundle of furs back into Elias's saddlebag. When morning came she intended to send him away with every one of them. Not because she wanted him to leave, but because she refused to profit from mercy. Outside, hidden among the trees overlooking the valley, 3 shadowed riders watched the warm glow of the Whitlock cabin through the darkness. One of them smiled coldly. "They're all together." Another adjusted the rifle across his saddle. "When do we tell Mr. Crow?" The first rider never took his eyes off the cabin. "We don't." He turned his horse toward the south. "We bring him here." Far below, Sarah added another log to the fire, unaware that before another sunset, the peace inside her little home would be shattered by men who measured every kindness in dollars, and every act of mercy as a weakness to exploit. The first sign of trouble came before sunrise. Sarah had just stepped onto the porch with a bucket in hand when she noticed fresh hoofprints pressed deep into the snow. They hadn't been there the night before. The tracks circled the cabin once, then disappeared back toward the timber. Someone had ridden close enough to study every window. She crouched beside the prints. 3 horses. Heavy animals. Shod recently. Not local. A chill settled over her that had nothing to do with the winter air. She hurried inside. "Elias." The trapper looked up immediately. One glance at Sarah's face told him everything. "They came." She nodded. "They were here during the night." He walked onto the porch and examined the tracks in silence. "They weren't scouting." "No. They wanted us to know they'd found us." Sarah looked toward the tree line. "Can we leave?" Elias considered it. "If I ride away now they'll follow. And if you stay? They'll come here." Neither answer offered much comfort. Marshal Ben Carter arrived less than an hour later. This time he wasn't alone. Deputy Amos Reed rode beside him, carrying a lever-action rifle across his saddle. Ben dismounted quickly. "They've crossed the river." Sarah's heart sank. "How many?" "Crow." He held up one finger. 6 hired men." Another pause. "And 2 wagons." "What do they need wagons for?" The marshal looked toward Elias. "To haul furs." Elias frowned. "I don't have any left." Ben nodded toward the cabin. "They don't know that." Then his expression darkened. "Or maybe they simply plan on taking everything else." By noon the valley was buzzing with rumors. Neighbors who had once whispered about Sarah's decision now rode toward her homestead instead of away from it. First came Jacob Miller, carrying his old shotgun across his lap. Then Samuel and Ruth Dawson. Then elderly Isaiah Cooper, whose hands shook from age but whose aim was still legendary. Mrs. Abigail Turner climbed down from her wagon carrying blankets, bandages, and enough bread to feed 20 people. Sarah blinked in surprise. "I thought you didn't trust strangers." Abigail gave a sheepish smile. "I still don't." She looked toward Elias. "But I trust you." One by one more neighbors arrived. Some brought rifles. Others brought food. No one had been asked. They simply came. Elias watched them in silence. "I don't understand." Sarah smiled. "This valley argues plenty." She looked around at the gathering crowd. "But when trouble rides in, people remember their neighbors first." Late that afternoon, a cloud of dust appeared on the southern trail. 8 riders. 2 wagons. Exactly as the marshal had warned. They stopped 50 yards from the cabin. The man at their front sat straight-backed on a black stallion polished as carefully as his expensive boots. Nothing about Jeremiah Crow looked like a trapper. His coat was tailored from the finest wool. Silver decorated his saddle. Gold rings gleamed on both hands. He smiled as though arriving for a friendly visit. "Well," he called. "I've finally found you." Elias stepped off the porch. "So you have." Crow looked him up and down. "I heard you were dead. I disappointed you." A few of Crow's men laughed. Crow didn't. "No." His smile widened. "You merely delayed our conversation." Marshal Carter moved forward. "This property belongs to Mrs. Sarah Whitlock." Crow barely glanced at him. "I'm here on business." "State it." Crow looked back at Elias. "You owe me." Elias's voice remained calm. "I owe you nothing. You trapped on land I purchased. You purchased paper. I purchased rights. You bought neither." The smile disappeared from Crow's face. "I've grown tired of your opinions. And I've grown tired of your greed." The air seemed to tighten. Even the horses shifted uneasily. Crow slowly lifted one hand. His riders spread out. Not charging. Simply surrounding. Sarah stepped off the porch. "You'll leave." Crow turned toward her as though noticing her for the first time. "You must be the widow." "I am." "I hear you've been generous." "I have." He nodded toward the cabin. "My men and I will search your property." "No." His eyebrows rose. "No." "You have no warrant." Crow laughed. "This isn't a courtroom." "No." Sarah met his eyes without flinching. "It's my home." For the first time, Crow's pleasant mask cracked. "Move." "I won't." He took a step forward. Before anyone else could react, half a dozen rifles clicked. Jacob Miller. Samuel Dawson. Isaiah Cooper. Deputy Reed. Marshal Carter. Even old Ruth Dawson stood with a shotgun resting steadily against her shoulder. Crow slowly turned. "What is this?" Marshal Carter answered. "A community." For several long seconds no one moved. Then one of Crow's hired men panicked. Perhaps he mistook the silence for weakness. Perhaps he simply wanted to prove himself. Whatever the reason, he jerked his rifle upward. The shot exploded across the valley. It struck the fence post inches from Sarah's shoulder. Chaos followed. Rifles thundered. Horses screamed. Men dove behind wagons. Windows shattered. The peaceful valley erupted into smoke and flying splinters. "Caleb!" Sarah shouted. The boy had been inside the cabin exactly as she had ordered. Now she saw him through the broken window, crouching beneath the kitchen table. Another bullet tore through the wall. Elias ran. Not toward cover. Toward the cabin. Crow's men fired after him. Wood splintered around his boots. One bullet ripped through his coat sleeve. Still he kept running. He burst through the front door just as another shot shattered the glass. "Come with me." He grabbed Caleb and threw both of them behind the stone fireplace as another volley crashed through the cabin. Sarah's heart nearly stopped. Outside, Marshal Carter's deputies returned fire with careful precision. Crow's hired men had numbers. The settlers had something else. They were protecting home. The fight spread across the yard. Jacob Miller overturned a wagon, creating cover. Ruth Dawson calmly reloaded while muttering scripture beneath her breath. Isaiah Cooper, despite being nearly 70, knocked a rifle clean from one attacker's hands with a shot so accurate it left everyone staring. Inside the cabin, smoke drifted through shattered windows. Caleb clung to Elias. "Are we going to die?" Elias looked the frightened boy in the eyes. "No. You don't know that." "No." He smiled gently. "But I know this." "What?" "No one fights harder than people protecting family." The word lingered. Family. Caleb squeezed his hand tighter. Outside, Crow realized the battle was turning. His hired men had expected one wounded trapper. Instead they found an entire valley standing together. His face twisted with anger. He pulled a revolver from beneath his coat. "If I can't have the trapper." He aimed past Elias. "I'll make certain he remembers this day." Sarah saw the movement first. "Crow." She threw herself forward. The gun fired. The bullet missed Elias by inches, striking the porch beam instead. Marshal Carter didn't hesitate. His own revolver cracked once. Crow's weapon spun from his hand. The wealthy fur trader stared in disbelief at the blood spreading across his wrist. Before he could reach for another gun, Deputy Reed tackled him into the snow. The remaining hired men froze. One after another. Their rifles fell to the ground. The valley grew quiet again. Only the frightened breathing of horses disturbed the silence. Marshal Carter hauled Crow to his feet. "It's over." Crow glared at Elias. "You think you've won?" Elias shook his head. "No. You'll never trap these mountains again." "I wasn't planning to." Crow laughed bitterly. "Then what have you gained?" Elias looked toward the cabin. Sarah stood in the doorway with Caleb beside her. Neighbors gathered all around them. No one stood alone. He answered softly. "Everything I thought I'd lost." As Crow was searched, Deputy Reed discovered more than pistols and ammunition. Hidden inside one wagon were account books, ledgers, signed contracts, letters. Marshal Carter opened one. His eyes widened. "My lord." "What?" "Payments." He turned another page. "Bribes." Another. "Land deeds." Then another. "The names?" Samuel Dawson stepped closer. "What names?" "Men who disappeared." The silence that followed seemed heavier than the gunfire had been. For years, Crow had believed money could bury every crime. Instead, he had carried the evidence with him, certain no one would ever dare challenge him. Marshal Carter snapped the ledger shut. "I've been waiting 15 years to put irons on you." Crow's confident smile was finally gone. That evening, the valley gathered inside Sarah's cabin. Broken windows had already been covered with blankets. The damaged porch was being repaired before sunset. Mrs. Turner served stew. Children laughed together. The men quietly discussed rebuilding the fence. Life was already beginning again. Sarah stood near the fireplace watching it all. She realized something extraordinary. A week ago, many of these same people had questioned her decision to shelter a stranger. Now that stranger had become the reason the valley stood united. Elias approached quietly. "I'm sorry." She looked at him. "For what?" "I brought danger to your door." She smiled. "No." He looked confused. "You brought the truth." "What truth?" She glanced around the crowded cabin. "That kindness isn't weakness." She looked toward the neighbors helping one another without being asked. "It reminds people who they really are." Elias followed her gaze. For the first time in many years, the burden he carried seemed lighter. Not gone. Grief never vanished that easily. But lighter. Outside, the last light of day settled over the snow-covered valley. The fire inside Sarah Whitlock's cabin burned brighter than ever. It had welcomed a wounded stranger seeking warmth for one night. Now it illuminated something far greater. A community that had discovered mercy was stronger than fear, and that a single act of compassion could change not only one life, but an entire valley. Spring announced itself quietly. The last patches of snow disappeared from the shaded hillsides first, leaving ribbons of green grass stretching across Cotton Creek Valley. Wildflowers pushed through the thawing earth in splashes of yellow and purple, while the cottonwood trees unfurled fresh leaves that shimmered in the morning breeze. The valley seemed to breathe again. So did Sarah Whitlock. For the first time in years, she awoke before sunrise without that familiar heaviness pressing against her chest. Grief had not vanished. She doubted it ever would. But it no longer greeted her before the dawn. Instead, she heard something else. Laughter. It drifted through the open kitchen window. She smiled before she even looked outside. Caleb and Elias were standing near the fence, trying to coax an old mule into pulling a stubborn tree stump from the pasture. The mule refused. Caleb pulled on the rope with all the strength an 8-year-old could muster. The mule looked at him with complete indifference. Elias folded his arms. "I believe he's waiting." "For what?" Caleb asked. "For you to apologize." "To a mule?" "He seems like the forgiving sort." Caleb laughed. "You made that up." "I absolutely did." The boy shook his head. "You almost fooled me." Sarah leaned against the windowsill watching them. Not long ago, the silence around the cabin had been almost unbearable. Now it had been replaced with conversation, teasing, and the ordinary sounds of people living together. She whispered a quiet prayer of thanks. Jeremiah Crow's trial had taken place nearly a month earlier. Marshal Ben Carter rode into the valley afterward carrying the news. Crow's ledgers had uncovered years of fraud, stolen trapping claims, bribery, and even the hiring of men responsible for several disappearances across the territory. Witnesses came from 3 settlements. Former employees testified. Families finally learned what had happened to fathers, brothers, and sons who had never returned from the mountains. Justice, though slow, had finally arrived. Crow would spend the rest of his life behind bars. When Ben shared the news, no one celebrated. Too many lives had already been broken. Instead, the valley gathered for prayer in the little church near the creek. They thanked God not for Crow's downfall, but for the truth finally coming into the light. Life settled into a peaceful rhythm. Each morning Elias rose before everyone else. He mended fences before breakfast, repaired tools after lunch, spent evenings teaching Caleb things Thomas had never had the chance to teach him. How to judge the weather by watching the clouds. How to find north without a compass. How to cross a river safely. How to respect every animal, whether hunting it or simply watching it. But the greatest lesson came unexpectedly. One afternoon, Caleb found an injured meadowlark beneath the old oak tree where Thomas was buried. The little bird had a broken wing. "Can we save it?" Caleb asked. Elias carefully picked up the trembling creature. "We can try." "For how long?" "As long as it needs." "What if it never flies again?" Elias smiled gently. "Then we'll still have done the right thing." For nearly 2 weeks, the bird rested in a small wooden box lined with soft cloth. Caleb fed it, changed its water, spoke to it every morning. Finally, on a warm afternoon they carried it outside. The little meadowlark hesitated on the edge of Caleb's hands. Then with one uncertain flap, another, it lifted into the air. The bird circled once above the pasture before disappearing toward the river. Caleb watched until it became nothing more than a tiny speck. Then he turned to Elias. "It came back." "What did?" I smiled. Elias looked at him. "I forgot what that felt like." The trapper rested one hand on the boy's shoulder. "So did I." Yet even as peace returned, Sarah noticed something. Every evening after supper, Elias stood alone on the porch looking west, toward the mountains, toward the life he had left behind. One evening she joined him. "You've been saying goodbye." He didn't deny it. "I have." "To us?" He looked surprised. "No." "Then to what?" He watched the setting sun settle behind the distant peaks. "For years I kept walking because I believed stopping meant forgetting." He took a slow breath. "I thought if I ever found peace." His voice grew quiet. "I'd somehow be leaving Anna and Matthew behind." Sarah understood. "So what changed?" He smiled sadly. "A little boy asked me if cardinals always fly in pairs." She laughed softly. "What did you tell him?" I said I didn't know. "You didn't?" "I'd never bothered to notice." He looked toward the pasture where Caleb was chasing butterflies. "For years I only saw what I'd lost." His eyes glistened. "Your son taught me to look at what God had left." Sarah felt tears welling in her own eyes. Sometimes children preached sermons without ever opening a Bible. A week later, Sarah awoke to an unfamiliar sound. Horse tack. Buckles. Leather straps. She stepped onto the porch. Elias stood beside his horse. Its saddle was packed. His rifle rested in its scabbard. The bundle of 10 beaver pelts was tied neatly behind the saddle. She had known this morning would come. Still, knowing did not make it easier. Caleb ran outside barefoot. "You're leaving?" Elias knelt before him. "I've stayed longer than I ever intended. But you don't have to." "I know." The boy's eyes filled with tears. "Then don't." Elias looked away for a moment before standing. Sarah walked back inside without saying a word. A minute later she returned carrying the bundle of beaver pelts. She untied them from the saddle and placed them firmly into Elias's hands. "You forgot these. They're yours." She shook her head. "No. You earned them. I told you before." He tried once more to hand them back. "You saved my life." Sarah smiled. "And you helped us live again." He stood speechless. She gently closed his fingers around the bundle. "You'll need them more than I ever will." "I can't accept them." "You already accepted my fire." He looked down. "You never took payment." "I wasn't selling kindness." The morning breeze stirred the cottonwood leaves above them. Sarah stepped closer. "My husband once told me something." Elias waited. "He said if you keep every blessing for yourself, eventually your hands become too full to receive another." She looked at the furs. "I think these belong in yours." For several long moments neither of them spoke. Then Caleb did something neither adult expected. He walked into the cabin. A minute later he returned carrying Thomas Whitlock's old fishing pole. It had rested above the fireplace untouched since the day Sarah's husband died. The boy held it out. "My pa would have wanted you to have this." Sarah's breath caught. She looked at the fishing pole. Then at her son. "Are you sure?" Caleb nodded. "He always said tools are meant to be used." Elias accepted it with trembling hands. "I don't deserve this." Caleb smiled. "My pa didn't think people had to deserve gifts." Sarah closed her eyes for a moment. That sounded exactly like Thomas. Elias mounted his horse. He tipped his hat. "Thank you." Sarah smiled. For what? He looked at the cabin, the pasture, the little barn, the valley stretching beyond. For reminding me that God still makes room for strangers. He turned the horse toward the road. It took only 3 slow steps before another voice stopped him. You could stay. It was Caleb. The boy stood in the middle of the yard. His face was red from trying not to cry. You don't have to leave. Elias looked at Sarah. She had not spoken. Neither of them had ever discussed such a possibility. She walked slowly toward them. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind moving through the trees. Finally she spoke. When you first knocked on my door, you asked for one night beside my fire. He nodded. You never asked for anything more. No. You've spent months giving this family pieces of itself back. She smiled through tears. I think it's our turn to give something back. He looked at her questioningly. She took one more step. Home. The word seemed to steal the breath from him. I don't know if I remember how. Sarah reached for his hand. You don't have to. We'll remember together. Months passed. Summer painted the valley in deep green. The Whitlock cabin became known for its open door. Travelers found meals there. Neighbors gathered after church for supper. Children filled the yard with games. Laughter echoed through every room. No one called Elias the stranger anymore. To Caleb he became Mr. Elias at first. Then, one quiet afternoon while repairing a fence together, the boy accidentally called him Pa. He froze immediately. I'm sorry. Elias looked at him with tears in his eyes. You don't ever have to apologize for love. Sarah watched from the porch. She said nothing. She simply smiled. Because healing never erased the people they had lost. Thomas Whitlock would always be Caleb's father. Anna and Matthew Mercer would always be part of Elias's heart. Love had not replaced love. It had simply made room for more. Years later, travelers passing through Cotton Creek Valley often heard the story of the widow who accepted no payment for saving a stranger's life. Some insisted the tale was about 10 priceless beaver pelts. Others claimed it was about a notorious fur trader finally brought to justice. But those who truly knew the story always smiled and said the same thing. The furs were never the treasure. The real gift was the fire. Not the flames burning in the stone hearth, but the kind that God kindles in a merciful heart. The fire that welcomes the weary, feeds the hungry, shelters the broken, and somehow leaves everyone warmer than before. Because one snowy night, a wounded stranger had offered 10 prime beaver furs for just one night beside a widow's fire. She refused his payment. Instead, she gave him something no fortune in the wilderness could ever buy. A family, a future, and the courage to believe that even after the darkest winter, the Lord still has a way of bringing spring to the hearts of those who trust Him.